Shabbat Shekalim is one of these special Shabbatot that I think is, goes unnoticed typically on on the Jewish calendar. It's probably for a variety of reasons. Maybe because it corresponds to President's Day week, I don't know. Be that as it may. Shabbat Shekalim, as we've said already, is gearing us up for Adar, which is gearing us up for Purim and also for Pesach a month later, but also it's gearing us up for 1 month from now, beginning the fiscal year. That's really what this is all about. But also, with Shabbat Shekalim and this beginning of the month of Adar, our tradition formally welcomes us not just into a new fiscal year, but also what you might call a sort of Jewish Mardi Gras season, especially with Purim in just 2 weeks. And famously, as many of you know, Purim invites us, perhaps more than commands us, to imbibe so much that we can't tell the difference between our oppressor and our friend. That's part of what Purim is all about. And that's exactly 1 month before you literally drink 4 cups of wine at dinner 2 nights in a row at Passover. Now, of course, this is an adult reading of Jewish time, but be that as it may, all of that is supposed to celebrate freedom and also are passing through, perhaps, biblical enslavement, but it's also a way of dealing with some of those painful memories. The painful memory of our oppression in Shushan, the painful memory of our enslavement in Egypt. And the springtime calendar hinges on opportunities to imbibe, specifically to deal with all of that trauma. It's a festive season as the natural world comes back to life, and it's a season that hinges on the memory of Jewish suffering. Now, we talk about suffering all the time. It's kind of a cliche, especially when you think we'd just be happy, like in the springtime. At so many of our holidays, we feast and drink to remember all the times that other peoples tried to destroy us and failed. At our weddings, we break glasses to remember the destruction of the temple. The memory of our suffering pervades our rituals, our humor, our politics, so much of Jewish life. But this presents something of a problem for us, not only because it's kind of melodramatic or insufferable, actually, but because by and large, many of us don't suffer as Jews. At least here in America, when so many of us can easily blend in and when our non-Jewish partners and friends delight in our customs, our Jewishness is not really a cause for suffering. So what's the point of having all these painful, inescapable Jewish memories? Why keep thinking of ourselves as a people who suffers when by most accounts we don't? Is it because we think that we'll one day suffer again? Is it to remind us of our relationship to the God of the Torah who brought our ancestors out of suffering to be their God? Or is it that the memory of the Jewish past might be a pretext for a moral high ground, suggesting that we deserve sympathy from other peoples because our people has just suffered so darn much in history? This week's Torah portion, Mishpatim, suggests a different answer and sets a different tone for this season with a verse that's familiar to many of us. You shall not oppress a stranger because you know the soul of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. We read a version of this mitzvah 36 times in the Torah, signifying its centrality in Jewish ethics. But this time the text says explicitly, you know the nefesh, the soul of the stranger. Rashi explains what may seem obvious to many of us. You know the soul of the stranger because you know what it's like to have suffered. And if you were to harm a stranger, you should be prepared for that stranger to argue that your cruelty is a sign that you've forgotten your own history. According to Rashi, it is by remembering previous suffering, even if it was long ago, that we see how wrong it is to cause another person to suffer. It is not a given that the Israelites should treat non-Israelites kindly. If this were so, the Torah wouldn't need to command it 36 times. After suffering as they had, wouldn't they be entitled to inflict suffering on others? Israeli commentator Nechama Leibovich points out that in human history, we often find that that is the case. In general, she writes, the hate, persecution, and shame the individual or community experiences in the past do not act as a deterrent, preventing them from adopting the same attitude to those entrusted to their power later on. The oppressed inevitably become oppressors throughout the course of history, and the cycle of suffering goes back and forth forever. The Israelites surely suffered in Egypt, as have the Jews, of course, throughout our history. But the Torah never implies that such suffering should be eternal for them or for us. And the commandment in this week's Parsha understands this. God presents this commandment because the presumption is that one day the Israelites will be in their own land, where they will be an empowered majority with minority strangers among them. And it's in that place where the people no longer suffer that they ought to remember the experience of their suffering. Joy Layden, professor of English at Yeshiva University and the only transgender faculty member of that institution, picks up on this. She writes, "This commandment combines hard-headed realism, the acknowledgement that even Israelites who are oppressed as strangers in the land of Egypt are likely to oppress others when they have a chance, with the idealistic belief that people who enjoy the privilege and power of being us can and will identify with those who are seen as them." As Layden explains, empathy is at the core of this mitzvah. It may not be human nature, but the Torah begs us to feel empathy for people who are unlike us. It's not always natural for people to feel empathy at all. But it's harder for us to feel empathy for another person when that person is dramatically different from who we are. And it's especially challenging to feel empathy for those who suffer when we ourselves have not directly experienced true suffering. So, since empathy is at the core of this Torah's command, or the Torah's command, we're commanded to remember our ancestors' suffering, remember a previous suffering, mythic or real. The Torah presumes that one day we won't suffer on account of our Judaism. The wisdom it offers, therefore, is especially apt for those of us who live secure in our Jewish lives, unafraid to be publicly Jewish in Brooklyn or Los Angeles or Tel Aviv. Admittedly, in certain places in the world and even in this country, Jews are less secure, as we know. Increasingly, those Jews who are visibly Jewish are not secure at all. But this commandment is particularly directed at the Jews who are, which likely includes many of us here this morning. Toward the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy, God doubles down on the need for Israelites to treat strangers with kindness. There, the command is phrased, "You must love the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt." It's not enough merely to not harm strangers. Here, we're commanded to love them. But what's interesting here is that by Deuteronomy, Moses is addressing a different sort of Israelite audience. Nearly 40 years have passed since the Exodus from Egypt. And this time, Moses is addressing the younger generation who will one day enter the Promised Land, a group of people who themselves may not actually have been in Egypt at all. They are to remember even the things they did not experience, and it's supposed to fuel their ethical behavior. We get an echo of this 6 weeks from now in the Mishnah, repeated in that Passover Haggadah that we'll read, where we learn that in every generation we are to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. We know we didn't. We say those words every year. But by imagining that we did, we allow ourselves to feel a connection to those mythic forebears and to those who continue to be oppressed wherever they are. Suffering for suffering's sake is pointless at best and self-serving at worst. And to be sure, many Jews are overly inward-looking when they focus only on the suffering of the Jewish people. But still, remembering our own suffering is also part of the commandment this week. And it's the subtext of Shabbat Shkalim, which inaugurates a season of rehashing ancient oppression. There is something essential in remembering just how much our people has suffered, because that memory has a purpose. By understanding our particular experience, we can attempt to grasp more universal truths about the world, and therefore build empathy for people who are unlike us. And though it might be abstract at times to focus so much on our own suffering, though it might be annoying for us, and it might feel like the butt of a joke, it's through the memory of suffering that we approach some kind of empathy through which we most meaningfully and ethically engage with the broader world. Shabbat Shalom.